Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the 2001 war epic Pearl Harbor. Now, before I get around to sharing more of my thoughts on this film, I would like to give a special shout out to Brian for requesting this review. And if there's another film, TV show, or topic that you would like to see me discuss in the future, feel free to donate to my PayPal or to my Patreon. The link to both will be in the video description down below, and I will try to get to your request as soon as I possibly can. Now, Pearl Harbor, it's one of those movies that has got this reputation of being a bomb, critically and financially. And financially, that's not really accurate, even though it did cost a record amount of money at the time, uh, with its $140 million budget, and it only made over $400 million worldwide. But if you take into account rentals and physical media sales, it made a profit for the studio in the long run. Maybe not as much as they would have liked, but that doesn't mean that it was a bomb. Critically, yeah, there were a lot of critics who were very outspoken at the time in terms of how much they didn't like the movie, but there were other critics that were more kind to it. It just seems like this is one of those films that has become more of a punching bag now, outside of something like the Razzies or select critics that gave it scathing reviews when it premiered in 2001. And I think it kind of started when Nostalgia Critic did his review of the movie and called it crap and so on and so forth. And so it became one of those movies where it was popular and trendy to shit on it. And because of this reputation, I did not expect much from this film. In fact, what I expected is that it was going to be bad. I thought it was going to be a really bad film. It'd be boring. The runtime was a massive turnoff to me, and it just didn't give me a lot of hope for the film, especially with Michael Bay involved. And it's not because I don't like Michael Bay as a director. In fact, it's quite the opposite. I think Michael Bay is an overhated director in general, and I think he's a lot more talented than people give him credit for. He has this reputation of being a hack or a director that doesn't know what he's doing or a guy who can just shoot explosions, and that's underselling his talents as a director considerably. I think he's honestly one of the best directors of his generation. I really do. I think he has some genuine talent behind the camera. He's very skilled, has a lot of varied abilities in terms of utilizing different camera techniques. He can evoke certain emotions that you want out of a scene. And yeah, he can also shoot explosions like the best of the best. Like, you want somebody to shoot an action sequence with a lot of explosions and a lot of pyrotechnics, there isn't anyone better when it comes to a director in their prime than Michael Bay. So I don't really feel that this is a film that fits him, though. And that's why I was extra leery about this movie, because I don't really feel that a historical war drama romance that's trying to recapture the success or the formula of Titanic is really the kind of movie for Michael Bay. And I would say, in some ways, this film proves that that's true, but in other ways, it shows that he might have been able to handle it. But I think the biggest problem, the biggest thing that ultimately kind of sinks this film, not entirely, but the biggest thing that at least prevents it from sailing safely throughout the entire runtime is not even Michael Bay's direction, because directing wise, I think the film looks really good. Um, I think that there is some inconsistencies though, in terms of the quality of the direction. And I think there are some scenes where you can see Michael Bay straining a little bit. It seems you can almost see a little bit of overcompensation happening, especially in the more heavily romantic scenes. They're trying to be like Jack and Rose in Titanic. That's not Michael Bay's forte. So those scenes seem like they're a little off. Like he is struggling. Kind of he's just not comfortable. But when it comes to the scenes that feature the various attacks and the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the Doolittle raid, I think he's uh at the still at the top of his game with this film. I think this film still features some really impressive, incredible direction when it comes to those sequences, especially the attack on Pearl Harbor. I think his direction in that sequence in particular is some of his best work as a director. So, Bay to me, he's not this film's biggest problem, even though I think he's not the best fit for it. I think Tony Scott or another director of the same vein as Tony would be a better fit for Pearl Harbor than Michael Bay. But the the issue is the script. That's really what it is, by Randall Wallace. Like the screenplay is the biggest problem, because this is one of those screenplays where the story doesn't know what it wants to be. It's not only completely inconsistent in terms of its narrative, it doesn't feel that cohesive. And on top of that, it also has tonal inconsistencies. And these tonal inconsistencies are very jarring. It starts from the very beginning, where its tone is honestly as subtle as a board to the balls. Like it really is. It starts out with these two kids who you find out are the younger uh, um, versions of these two main characters, Rafe and Danny, and they're best friends, and they're playing around in the barn and in a fake plane, and they're playing pretend as if they're pilots, and they're in a dogfight, and then they go into Danny's father's plane and start messing around in there, and then they accidentally turn the engine on and they almost fly. Danny's father figures that out, sees what's happening, is pissed. Understandably so, to be honest, because it seems like that's like his livelihood. Probably uses that plane to do crop dusting and stuff, and doesn't want any of his equipment messed up, or doesn't want the plane to crash. And so you can kind of understand why he's upset, at least, but not to the extreme that he is, because he shows up, he's angry at his son, and then he starts whooping him. And you're like, whoa, okay, like, where are we going here? Uh this is not the right tone. And yeah, the father's just whooping his kid. The Rafe, he stands up for his friend, grabs a board, starts hitting Danny's dad with it. He then talks to Danny's father and calls him a dirty German. And the father's like taken aback by this, and he's offended. He's like, "What? I fought the Germans. Don't you ever compare me to the likes of them," or something along those lines. And you're like, I hope you never have to see what I saw. And you're like, well, okay, all right. And then he just walks off. You're like, what? And then it just flashes forward to many, many years later, where Danny and Rafe, they're hotshot pilots in the military, and or is it the Navy? I'm not 100% sure which. I think it might be the Navy because like they're on an aircraft carrier, so or I don't know if they aren't actually on an aircraft carrier. They're on a base, but whatever. They're pilots, and now they're doing like Top Gun type stunts in midair. You're like, oh, come on, man! Like, really? Like, this is based on a true story about a real tragedy in American history. Maybe it's not the time to do Top Gun stunt tricks in the air, but okay, all right. That's a little thing, but it's still just tonal inconsistence at its finest. And then you get to the love story between Rafe and this nurse named Evelyn. And the way that that is all portrayed, it's so schmaltzy and sugary sweet. And you're like, why are you giving me milkshakes with cherries on top when there's an impending attack going to happen? I understand that was intentional. They were trying to do that to create a false sense of security or safety for Americans, to showcase how Americans as a whole felt uh, their time in America was before Pearl Harbor. But it just comes across as something that feels uneven. It doesn't really feel like it's that cohesive. It feels like you're watching two different films. These two things don't fit together very well. It it's like peanut butter and horseradish. The two don't mix. At least not in the way that they're structured and written in this screenplay. It doesn't help either that the romance that unfolds happens so fast that it's hard to believe that these two fall so hard for one another. And also, the way that a lot of these characters are written is very paper thin. Or if it's not thin, they're written in ways where they're not very likable. To be honest, Rafe is not a likable guy. He's manipulative in terms of his relationship with his girlfriend, and he's incredulous at the thought that if his girlfriend and his best friend thought that he was dead, that somebody else, including his friend, might possibly decide to date his girlfriend. And it's like, it's not like, oh, she's the love of your life. You literally dated her once before you went off to England. So it's like, what? Love of my life, my ass. She was pretty much a one night stand that you just tried to make into this big deal, and manipulated her and gave her the cold shoulder. And yeah, the way that Rafe is written is not great. And the writer assumes that he's a likable character. Like this is charming. I'm like, this isn't charming at all. Comes across like a total douchebag. And the character of Danny is not much better, but at least he's not as much of an asshole. And like the other characters, like the other pilots, the guy who stutters, like really? We have a guy who stutters for comedic effect. Why? And the other guy's like, I don't even remember any of their names. Same thing goes for the other nurses. I think uh might as well call them, the Giggle Twins or the Giggle Sisters, because that's all they really contributed to the film, is just a bunch of giggling for the most part. But yeah, the story, you would think that with the film about Pearl Harbor, it would all be about tension. That would be what it would be. It's about tension. It's about waiting. It's about the attack, uh, and doom, and just this sense of just dread that's permeating throughout. And I think if you had a balance that was more consistent with the sugary, sweet, schmaltzy stuff, with the rom com elements and the romance and uh uh all of that, then you might have something. Like if you juxtapose some of these scenes with Rafe and Evelyn and some of these other characters and this romance and like the comedy, but you have like scenes there where you're showing what's going on in Japan and showing the tension that's starting to build between Japan and America, then you might have something here, because you could be like, oh well, it would really hammer home that America is is kind of oblivious. They got their heads in the sand. They're just thinking that everything is all hunky dory and everything's like a postcard. Even though there's a war in Europe and there's tensions that are building between America and Japan. No, we don't get that. Randall Wallace doesn't give us that. Instead, you get an hour and a half of just a generic cliched love story, and then the attack on Pearl Harbor happens. And once that happens, once the attack happens, and yes, there are some other stuff, I will give it credit, that does show some of the impending doom, like the stuff with Dan Aykroyd's character and like the admiral, who's there. I think he's the captain of one of the ships over at Pearl Harbor, and he's like, "Hey, if this doesn't seem right. I think there's a strong chance, there's a possibility that we might be a target." And that's honestly some of the most effective stuff in the first half of this film, is the stuff that deals with this uh impending sense of doom and the tensions that are rising and cutting to Japan and the military and them planning the attack. More of that should have been the focus instead of this romance. It really should have been. The romance should have been secondary or third when it comes to all of the planning and just the build to the attack. And I know other critics have pointed this out where, oh, Rafe and Danny, they're not on the boats or they're not on the ships when they're blown up and they're attacked by the Zeros. I don't really have a problem with that, because historically, when that happened, pretty much almost everybody died. It's like there were some survivors for sure, who survived in the water, but there was a catastrophic loss of life when it comes to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So having these fictional characters be on there and then survive, I think that would be kind of messed up in a different way. We're like, oh, these two fictional guys. Also, it makes no sense for them to be on there. They're pilots. They're not sailors. It doesn't make sense for them to actually be on the boat in the first place. So I don't think that's really that big of a deal that they're not on the boats when the boats are being attacked. I think the problem is that these characters, in the case of Danny, he's too much of a blank slate to really honestly connect with him that much. And in the case of Rafe, he's too unlikable to connect with him on a deeper level. And we have all the other characters that don't really have much screen time, don't have any depth. So that's really a bigger problem when it comes to the attack, is that it's not that, oh, these characters aren't on the boat. It's just that the characters as a whole aren't very strong. They're not written that well. So when you get to the attack itself, it I wouldn't say it comes across as hollow, but it definitely is a bit shallow because of the fact that there's no like real connection that you have other than oh my god, this is intense. Like holy shit, like this is horrific and this is sad and this is awful. And that does have its effective moments for sure. I give Randall Wallace credit when it comes to these scenes dealing and detailing the attack of Pearl Harbor. Like these scenes don't hold back in terms of their brutality and intensity, even for a PG-13 film. I know there's a director's cut that's R-rated, but it adds a bunch of, in my opinion, over the top violence that really wasn't necessary. I think that it still gets the point across very well without having any of that. Plus, CGI blood is very distracting, especially early 2000s CGI blood. Like it looks like crap. So that doesn't help the film. That's detrimental to the movie to me because it takes me out of those scenes. So I prefer the theatrical version, even though it's not as gory. Or this isn't a slasher film, so I'm not looking for gore. But I was surprised by how much they still were able to get away with when it comes to the version that actually was released in theaters. I mean, there's some really harrowing, just gut punching scenes in this attack sequence. And there's some bullshit, like the stuff with the Japanese attacking the hospital. I know why it's there to have a connection with Evelyn and raise the stakes and so on. I get it. But this was very disrespectful and it was too much of a stretch because the Japanese that went against everything that they believed in. They never bombed a hospital. Um, they did bomb the harbor and killed a lot of people, but they even had a line that they wouldn't cross. And so I do feel that that's disrespectful in a lot of ways. And it's just disrespectful, period, to take the chances that the script did by Randall Wallace and uncredited writers, including maybe Michael Bay, because you're dealing with a real tragedy, and so when you have these characters that are based on real people, it, or have traits that are taken from real people, and taking creative liberties the way that Randall and company do with this film, it is kind of a slap in the face. It really is. So I think that was definitely a mistake. And speaking of real people, I think the film should have focused more on the actual real survivors or the actual real people involved with this event, not mostly on these three fake people in their love triangle amidst the tragedy of Pearl Harbor. I think the attack on Pearl Harbor should be something that has more prominence over a love story, over a love triangle. I really do. Like that's another thing that seems kind of disrespectful. Titanic's a different thing altogether. That was a tragic accident. A luxury cruise liner hit an iceberg and it sank. It isn't a act of war. You know, there's a difference. And this kind of is also a problem with what happens after the attack. Because you get the whole stuff with more of the love triangle stuff, and you get the Doolittle raid, and the way that that was presented was just so cliche, typical Hollywood uh, bullshit, really. And I get why it's set up there. So, you know, you get to see a win before the end of the movie, but it still has to be tied into this love triangle nonsense. So it just feels not necessarily as impactful as it could be. And it's just one of those things where, like I said, it's not, in my opinion, a terrible film. And I'm not going to sit here and say that the script is outright awful either. When it comes to the attack itself, when it comes to some of the moments where it's building up to it, when it comes to the scene with FDR standing up, even though that's not realistic at all and it never happened, that still creates a compelling moment. It's just one of those screenplays where the focus is just off. And you have the total inconsistencies that are thrown in there too, where it's trying to be funny, and that doesn't work for a movie about Pearl Harbor. Then you have all this other stuff with the love triangle and the soap opera angle in terms of the story. That honestly, the writer doesn't do the best job at all in terms of making you actually care about it. So it's just, yeah, it's just a very inconsistent screenplay in a multitude and in a myriad of different ways. When it comes to the strength of the characters, when it comes to the way that it's detailing the real historical events, when it comes to the right focus, tone, and sometimes even dialogue, because some of the dialogue in this is incredibly corny and cheesy. So it's just one of those screenplays where no, it's not outright garbage, but there's too much garbage. There's just too much about it that isn't good or doesn't work as well as it should for comfort. It really is. It's like, why is this so bad? Randall Wallace, he does a lot of scripts that take a lot of creative liberties. Braveheart is one of them, but that's not a bad screenplay. Like, that's still a good script, even though it's taking a lot of creative liberties when it comes to history. This is just at best mediocre. It really is. And it's also one of those scripts and stories where you're like, okay, this is so aggressively mediocre most of the time. Why is this so long? Like, cut out 30 to 40 minutes of this useless soap opera stuff that doesn't add anything to the movie to begin with. And then you would make the film a little tighter and you would make it better by default just because it doesn't drag so much. But that's just me. Now, the cast, this is one of those casts where you have good actors, but they don't necessarily deliver consistently good, let alone great performances. Ben Affleck, I think he's a good actor. I think he's got charisma. I think he's terrible in this. Like, it's really surprising. It was honestly pretty shocking to me. I was like, wow, he's really bad in this movie. Uh, he's so bad that Josh Hartnett seems like he's acting circles around him. He's flying circles around Ben Affleck as Rafe. There's some really bad acting in this by Ben Affleck. There's a line delivery by him that really sounds like he just does not want to be there and does not give a shit. There are scenes where he has this accent that just comes and goes. I think it doesn't help that he's playing a character the way that he's written. It doesn't really enable Ben to use his charisma. It just makes him come across like an even bigger douchebag. So I think, yeah, it's not definitely not one of his best performances. In fact, I think it's one of his worst out of his career, to be honest. His acting when he's supposed to be sad and in anguish when his friend Danny dies at the end is so cringe. Like, it's so bad. It really is. Josh Hartnett, not horrible, but he's like a saltine cracker. Like, really, that is just so bland. Such a bland performance. Not bad, but bland for sure. It's a very bland performance overall. Kate Beckinsale, gorgeous, absolutely beautiful woman. She definitely looks great in this. I think she does a pretty decent job, even though a lot of her characters just being sad over which boyfriend is potentially going to die versus the other. But I still think it was a relatively good performance by her. Tom Sizemore, I had fun with his performances, Sergeant Earl. So much so, I wish that he was in the film more. Why can't we have more scenes with Tom Sizemore's character? Uh, the rest of the nurses, just there's not much to say about them. Jamie King is Betty. Catherine Kellner is Barbara. Jennifer Garner, before she made it big, is Sandra. Sarah Rue is Martha. Or William Lee Scott is Billy. Or Ewan Bremer is Red. Like, you have Michael Shannon, who's in this as a guy named Goose. Didn't mind him. Dan Aykroyd, he's great as Captain Harold Thurman, even though mostly he's just saying a lot of exposition. But I thought he was really good. The U.S. Naval Intelligence Officer. Kim Coates, he's one of the lieutenants. You've got Leland Orser. He plays a major. Andrew Bernarski plays a crew member who gets boxed by um Cuba Gooding Jr.'s character. You've got some well-known actors who play the Japanese. Uh, Mako, Hiroki Togawa. Um, Cuba Gooding Jr. Uh, Jon Voight's also in it as Franklin D. Roosevelt. It would, in all honesty, is pretty bad makeup. Alec Baldwin as Major Jimmy Doolittle. Um, Peter Firth as the commanding officer of the West Virginia. Colm Feore as the admiral. So it's you got a lot of capable, good performers and good actors in this, but a lot of just either bad performances or performances that are just kind of there, just run of the mill, just just meh. So, and I don't know if it really is something that Michael Bay is to blame for. I don't honestly think he is. I think it's more of a thing that really comes down to the script. I really do. What they're given to work with. Now, when it comes to other technical aspects of the movie, pretty effective, pretty solid. Some good, nice looking cinematography by John Schwartzman. It's got some good editing by Chris Levinson, Mark Goldblatt, Steven Rosenblum, and Roger Barton. The score by Hans Zimmer, I thought it was fantastic. I think it's honestly one of his best scores. It's very heartfelt. It's very bittersweet. It's traumatic and intense when it needs to be, but it's also triumphant, and it's just a really gorgeous score. I think the compositions that he created for this are just really special, and it elevates a lot of the scenes in the film. I think a lot of the emotion that you feel in the movie is in a lot of ways due to the score by Hans Zimmer and what he's able to evoke with his compositions and the notes that he's building for the film. The runtime is too long, 183 minutes. This had no business being that long. A good chunk of it is just this love story and this love triangle, which if you just trim that down by half, you'd have a much tighter film and honestly a much better movie. But even if you just did that, there's still all these other problems and other issues with it that I think ultimately it still wouldn't fully rise above the water. It would still sink a little. or at least halfway. But I still would recommend checking it out at least once just for the sequences that show the attack on Pearl Harbor. I really do. And for some little performances here and there by some of the actors like Dan Aykroyd and Jon Voight and so on. But it's not what I would consider to be a classic. I wouldn't personally call it underrated. Uh but at the same time, I don't think it's just a bomb or a really bad film or a total piece of crap or a hunk of garbage. I don't agree with that. I think it does have some merits, and there are other war films. Almost said horror film. I'm so used to talking about horror movies. And in some ways it kind of is a horror film. I mean, the attack on Pearl Harbor is pretty freaking horrific. But there are other war movies that definitely have a lot more going for them than Pearl Harbor. But it's still not terrible. Like it's adequate. It's okay. Anyway, thanks for watching my review of Pearl Harbor, and until next time, I'll see you later. See ya.